For 8 years, this couple prayed for just one thing. They didn't want money. They didn't want a bigger house. They wanted a child. The husband had already imagined what that life would look like. He imagined holding his baby for the first time. He imagined the tiny hand grabbing his finger. He imagined hearing his child call him Dad. And then, one completely ordinary day, everything changed. What happened next would make the dream they'd waited years for one of the most heartbreaking moments of their lives. For years, they lived a simple life. They didn't have much money, but they had each other. The husband worked as a security guard, while his wife worked as a maid in the same household. They didn't have a big house or an expensive lifestyle, but they were deeply in love, and they were happy with the life they had built together. There was just one thing they desperately wanted: a child. They had been married for years, and every night they hoped and prayed that someday they would finally become parents. The husband thought about it constantly. He imagined holding his baby for the first time. He imagined those tiny fingers wrapping around his hand. He imagined watching his child take their first steps, and one day hearing them call him Dad. For 8 years, that was the future he was waiting for. And then, on an ordinary day at work, everything changed. The next morning, he arrived for another normal shift. He was working security at a private home, standing outside the entrance with the firearm he carried for his job. There was nothing unusual about the day. No warning. No sign that anything was about to happen. At some point during his shift, he decided to clean the firearm. What happened next was a tragic accident. While handling it, the weapon suddenly discharged. The bullet struck him in the neck and caused a fatal injury. He died at the scene, and in a matter of seconds, the future he'd spent 8 years imagining was gone. He would never hold the child he'd dreamed about. He would never see their face, and he would never know that the life he had been waiting for was already beginning. For months, she carried 2 things with her every day: the grief of losing her husband, and the child they had spent 8 years praying for. And the timing made the loss even harder to accept, because while she was mourning him, she was also realizing that the dream they had talked about for years was finally becoming real. He had spent so much time imagining what it would be like to become a father. Yet he died without ever knowing how close he actually was. And that thought must have been incredibly painful for his wife. The future he had been waiting for was already on its way. He just never got the chance to see it. But there was still one final moment ahead. The day she would finally hold the child they had wanted for so long. Eventually, the day they had spent years waiting for finally arrived. The baby was born. For the first time, the woman could hold the child she and her husband had dreamed about for so many years, but there was no husband beside her, no one to share that first moment with, no one to reach out and take the baby from her arms. The dream had finally become real, but the person who had wanted it most was missing from the moment. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of all. She had spent years imagining what it would feel like to become a mother. Her husband had spent those same years imagining what it would feel like to become a father. Now she was holding their child, but he would never know what it felt like. After the baby was born, she had to learn how to raise a child without the person she had expected to do it with. She had lost her husband, but she still had a reason to keep going. She worked. She cared for her child. And little by little, she built a life around the family they had once dreamed about. As the child grew older, there were milestones the father would never see. First steps, first words, birthdays, and all the ordinary moments that make up a childhood. But the mother never forgot who had been waiting for those moments long before the child was born. She kept her husband's memory alive by telling her child about the man he was, the husband who loved her deeply, the father who had spent years hoping they would one day exist. And even though the child never got the chance to meet him, They grew up knowing they had been deeply wanted and loved before they were even born. Years later, she still remembered the life they had before everything changed. It wasn't a wealthy life. It wasn't a perfect life. But it was theirs. And somehow, the dream they had shared continued through the child he never got to meet. He never got to hold his child. But the family he spent